The rain was falling in relentless sheets that night, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, closer, almost suffocating. I remember pulling my coat tighter, the water seeping into the seams, soaking through despite my best efforts, and feeling the first stirrings of unease that would not leave me for the rest of the evening. I had left the apartment later than usual, thinking a walk through the park might calm my mind. But instead, the familiar path seemed alien under the relentless downpour. Puddles formed mirrors that reflected distorted streetlights, and each distorted shadow looked like it was moving on its own, shifting just out of the corner of my eye. That first night, I didn't know it would be the beginning of a series of experiences that would make me question everything I had ever considered normal. As I passed the old bridge near the far end of the park, the sound of water hitting metal combined with the rumble of distant thunder created a symphony of dread that wrapped around me like a shroud. And then I saw him. Or rather, I thought I did. A figure tall and hunched, leaning against the railing. The rain hid most of the details, but something about his posture, the unnatural stillness, made my stomach knot. I told myself it was just a homeless man seeking shelter from the storm. But instinctively, I slowed my pace, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Every step I took echoed off the wet pavement, and for a moment, I swore I heard another echo, a shadow of my own steps, lagging slightly behind. I tried to shake it off, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. My heart started racing. Maybe it had been the reflection, the way the water distorted everything. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone or something was following me. The next day, I told a friend about it, half joking, half serious. He laughed, of course, but there was a hesitation in his eyes that I couldn't interpret. "You probably just startled yourself," he said. "Rain makes everything creepier than it really is." And yet, I felt certain that wasn't it. That night, I returned to the park, this time with a flashlight, reasoning that light would make shadows less deceptive. But as I walked the same path, I noticed footprints in the mud, deep and deliberate, leading off into the trees. I followed them cautiously, heart pounding, until the trail disappeared into a patch of brush. I paused, listening to the wind whipping through the branches, and that's when I heard the whisper. A voice, low and raspy, that seemed to carry on the wind, calling my name. I froze, telling myself it couldn't be real, that maybe it was the sound of the wind playing tricks on me. But the whisper came again, closer this time. "Don't turn around," it said, almost pleading, and the tone of it sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, the flashlight cutting a thin path through the darkness. And there, half hidden by the fog and branches, was a figure wearing a rain-soaked coat, its face obscured by shadows. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen in place, like roots gripping the wet soil. The figure raised its hand slowly, pointing directly at me. And then it spoke again, this time clearly, with a voice that was unmistakably human, yet somehow warped, as if distorted by the rain itself. "You shouldn't be here." I don't know why I did it, but I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. "Yeah, well, neither should you, buddy," I said, attempting a bravado I didn't feel. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just watched. And then, without warning, it bolted, slipping between trees and disappearing into the fog like it had never existed. I ran the rest of the way home, soaked, trembling, certain that my perception of reality was slipping. But the worst part came the next morning. There was a message scribbled on the condensation of my apartment window. "You'll come back." I tore the note down, thinking it was a prank. But over the next week, I began noticing small things out of place. Doors that I was certain I had locked were slightly ajar. My mailbox, which never held anything except bills, contained a single black feather one morning. And everywhere I went, I had the sensation of being watched. People in the streets glanced at me a moment too long. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense. I stopped going to the park alone. But still, the feeling persisted. A week later, a friend convinced me to join her for a late-night coffee at a cafe not far from my apartment. It was a small place, dimly lit, with the warm hum of conversation and the soft clatter of cups. I was trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that my mind was exaggerating things because of stress. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it again. The eyes. Across the room, a man in a dark coat sat with his hood up, barely visible, yet unmistakably staring at me. I froze for a moment, trying to focus elsewhere. But when our eyes met, I swear he smiled. Just the faintest curve of the lips, before disappearing behind a pillar. I told my friend nothing, not wanting to appear paranoid, but I knew. I knew that whatever had followed me through the rain was still out there, still patient, still waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. The sound of rain hitting the windows became unbearable, each drop a hammer against my skull. I kept imagining shadows moving along the walls of my room, figures standing silently in the corners, watching. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We're closer than you think." My hands shook as I held the device, debating whether to call the police or throw the phone across the room. I did neither. Instead, I kept watch, staring at the window as the storm raged outside. The words repeating in my mind, "We're closer than you think." The following days became a blur of anxiety. I avoided the park entirely, stayed inside whenever possible, and started noticing patterns that I couldn't explain. Lights flickered when I walked past rooms. Objects shifted slightly on tables. And sometimes, I could swear, I heard footsteps following me, even when I was alone. One afternoon, I found a small, perfectly round puddle of water in my hallway that hadn't been there before. I checked the apartment from top to bottom, convinced that maybe there was a leak, but everything was dry. That night, I found another message, this time scratched into the surface of my bathroom mirror. You can't hide. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my family. I felt trapped, isolated, and every day that rain continued, it felt like the air itself was closing in on me. I began carrying an umbrella indoors, not for the rain, but as a talisman against the unknown. I started keeping a flashlight under my pillow, checking locks obsessively, counting every creak and shadow. Every night, I dreamt of the figure, standing silently, waiting. Its form always distorted, always shifting with the patterns of rainfall. I would wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering, certain that something had moved in my room while I slept. Weeks passed, and I began noticing messages in places I hadn't been. On the bus, on my doormat, on the back of receipts from the corner store. Each one simple, concise, and threatening. Soon, not far, watching. I debated moving, but every attempt seemed pointless. No matter where I went, the rain would follow, and with it, the presence that had been haunting me from the first night on the bridge. I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't about physical proximity. This was psychological, a stalking of the mind, an invasion of my perception of reality itself. By the end of the month, I had begun avoiding all social interactions. I stopped answering calls, stopped leaving the apartment for anything other than essentials, and even then, I took convoluted routes to avoid familiar paths. Each day was a careful negotiation with fear. Each night, a battle against imagination. And always, always, the rain fell. By the time the second storm arrived, I had begun to question my own sanity. It wasn't just the rain anymore. It was the way the world felt different when it poured, as if the downpour peeled back a layer of normalcy to reveal something darker underneath. That evening, I had convinced myself to leave the apartment, reasoning that avoiding the outside world entirely was no way to live. I put on my thickest coat, grabbed an umbrella, and stepped out into the puddle-strewn streets. The rain pelted my face, and the wind tugged at my umbrella until I felt like a child struggling against the elements. Every step I took echoed across empty sidewalks. Yet I could have sworn I was hearing soft footsteps behind me, never in rhythm with my own. I paused at the intersection near the old pharmacy, the streetlights refracting in the puddles to create distorted, shifting shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing across the street, staring at me from under a soaked hood. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaking my head, I walked on, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and paranoia were playing tricks on me. But as I turned into the quieter part of the street, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I could almost hear the whispered echo of footsteps matching mine in some perverse, invisible rhythm. I gripped my umbrella like a weapon, my mind running through every horror story I had ever read, every film I had ever watched. Halfway to the small cafe I had chosen for shelter, I passed an alleyway and froze. There, framed by the dim glow of a flickering street light, was the figure. This time, I saw more clearly. A long coat, drenched and plastered to its frame. Boots that sank slightly into the waterlogged street, and a face partially obscured by the hood, pale and expressionless. My heart thundered as I took a cautious step forward. My rational mind screamed to run, but my curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of dread, kept me rooted in place. Then, as I blinked, it was gone. No movement, no sound. Just the rain and the occasional drip from a leaking gutter. I reached the cafe and pushed the door open. The warm air hitting my cold, wet face like a small mercy. The bell above the door jingled faintly, drawing a few glances from the other patrons. I chose a table by the window, giving me a clear view of the street outside. Though I felt no real comfort. My fingers wrapped around the mug of hot tea, hands shaking slightly. The barista, cheerful and unaware of my inner panic, placed the cup in front of me with a smile. I nodded, forcing a small smile in return, but my mind was elsewhere, imagining what the figure was doing now, how it might be waiting for me once I stepped back into the storm. As I sat there, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows in an almost hypnotic rhythm. My eyes kept flicking to the reflections, searching for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. And then, from across the room, I saw it again. The figure, standing near the corner, blending with the shadows, hood pulled low. My breath caught in my throat. I could see nothing but a faint outline, but the sense of malice was undeniable. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the unease had reached a level that could not be dismissed. I sat frozen, watching as the figure remained perfectly still, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to move toward the door. I debated whether to confront it, run, or call for help, but before I could make a decision, it had vanished. The door to the cafe opened, letting in a gust of wind and a few dripping pedestrians, but no one resembling the figure entered. My pulse slowly began to settle, and I forced myself to take a sip of tea, trying to convince my mind that I had imagined everything. Perhaps it was the stress, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety that had made me see shapes in the dark. Maybe the rain had warped reality. Or maybe, as I feared, the figure was real, patient, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. I stayed longer than usual, trying to gather my thoughts. But as the clock ticked, I felt that same invisible pressure, that feeling of being studied. Finally, I decided to leave, reasoning that the street, wet and empty, was safer than lingering inside. As I stepped out, the wind caught my umbrella and nearly toppled me, forcing me to fight for control. My eyes scanned the shadows, every darkened doorway, every corner of the street, searching for the outline of that hooded figure. I found nothing, but the sense of dread lingered like a second skin. I walked faster, my shoes splashing in puddles, until I reached the familiar steps of my apartment. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as if it could absorb my fear. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound, the rain, the hum of distant traffic, the creak of the building settling, felt amplified, threatening. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my door. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently. But the only sound was rain. Hours passed in a mixture of vigilance and terror, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep filled with dreams of shadowed figures and endless rain. Days blurred together, each one dominated by a nervous ritual of checking doors, peering out of windows, and listening for unfamiliar sounds. I stopped leaving the apartment except for essential errands, and even then, I carried a small flashlight in one hand and my keys tightly gripped in the other. Friends reached out, asking why I had become so reclusive, and I simply shrugged, offering vague excuses about work and stress. No one could understand the constant pressure, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something unseen. And then the notes started appearing again, small slips of paper left in my mailbox, tucked under the mat, and even taped to my front door. Each one contained a single word: soon. One evening, as I gathered the courage to walk to the grocery store, I noticed movement at the corner of my eye. A person, tall, hunched under the rain, followed at a careful distance. I quickened my pace, heart hammering, trying to appear casual, but I could feel the intensity of those eyes. When I dared to look directly, they were gone, melting into the shadows. Panic surged through me, cold and unrelenting. I ran the last block, slipping on wet cobblestones, adrenaline pushing me forward. Once inside the store, I tried to catch my breath, glancing at every reflection, every shadow, but the figure never appeared again, at least not in the light. The nights became longer, each one an exercise in endurance. I started locking every window, every door, double-checking, triple-checking, making notes of every creak or whisper. The rain became a constant soundtrack, a reminder that the unseen presence was still out there, patient, waiting. One particularly violent storm shook the city. windows rattling and street lights flickering. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, staring at the black expanse of the street. And that's when I saw the reflection of the hooded figure in the glass, standing just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. After that night, I couldn't convince myself that the figure was imaginary. The reflection in the glass, so vivid and immediate, made the distinction between reality and nightmare impossible. Sleep became a battlefield, each night a test of endurance. I began leaving lights on in every room, but the shadows still seemed to move, curling in corners where the light failed to penetrate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hooded figure, standing silently in the rain, its face always obscured, always watching, always patient. I tried rational explanations. Of course. Maybe it was stress, maybe paranoia, maybe sleep deprivation. But the reality was that no rational explanation could erase the physical evidence. The notes, the footprints outside my building, the faint scratches on my doorframe, as if something had tried to mark its territory. I stopped leaving my apartment entirely, ordering groceries online, avoiding social interactions, isolating myself until the walls felt like a cage. Even then, I could feel it, the presence lingering just outside the door, waiting, patient, meticulous. One night, I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't ignore, tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was a branch, scraping against the glass in the wind. But the rhythm was deliberate, too patterned to be natural. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening intently. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again, steady, precise. I inched toward the window, gripping the edge of the sill, and peeked through the blinds. A shadow loomed there, the outline unmistakable, tall, hunched, hooded. My breath caught. The figure raised a hand, and even through the pain, I felt the weight of its gaze. Then it vanished. From that point, the presence escalated. I began noticing subtle disturbances in the apartment. Objects slightly out of place, doors left ajar, shadows that lingered too long. Once, I awoke to find muddy footprints on the carpet leading from the door to the kitchen and back. Yet, there was no sign of forced entry. Every evening, the rain seemed to intensify, pounding on windows and rooftops with a relentless fury. As if the storm itself was complicit, I started keeping a journal, meticulously documenting every event, every anomaly, hoping that recording the occurrences would make them more tangible, more understandable. But no pattern emerged, only fear and the relentless pressure of being watched. Then came the call, a simple ringtone cutting through the storm, echoing ominously in the apartment. My hands shook as I answered. The line was silent at first, and then a voice, low and distorted, whispered, You can't run. I slammed the phone down, heart racing, and double-checked every lock. The voice wasn't threatening in the conventional sense. It carried something subtler, more insidious, a psychological imprint that made the skin crawl and the mind race. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely, but the implication was clear. It knew me, it had followed me, and it was capable of finding me no matter what I did. I began to avoid sleeping, staying awake as long as possible to monitor the apartment. The rain outside became a constant, oppressive soundtrack. The rhythmic pounding on the roof blending with imagined whispers in the corners of my mind. Exhaustion warped my perception. The shadows became more defined, more threatening, and every creak of the building sounded like deliberate movement. I couldn't distinguish between reality and fear, between imagination and the tangible world. And through it all, the figure waited, always patient, always just beyond my vision, a persistent phantom in the storm. One particularly harrowing night, the power went out. The city plunged into darkness, streets illuminated only by occasional lightning flashes that illuminated the world in stark, ghostly white. I fumbled for a flashlight, heart pounding, trying to ignore the fear clawing at my chest. And then, in the brief glow of the lightning, I saw it standing at the edge of the hallway, closer than ever before. For a fraction of a second, its face emerged from the shadows. A hollow visage, pale, wet, expressionless, eyes fixed on me with a calculated patience that froze my blood. The lightning flickered again, and it was gone, leaving me in total darkness. I huddled on the floor, trembling, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, waiting for the storm to pass, but knowing it never would. By now, I had become a ghost of my former self, haunted not only by the figure outside, but by my own mind. Friends tried to reach out, texts and calls ignored, invitations declined. I could barely process conversation without imagining the figure lurking nearby, silently observing, silently judging. Every reflection, every shadow, every distorted shape in the rain-soaked streets became a potential threat. I developed routines, meticulous, obsessive, designed to avoid detection, leaving for errands only when the rain subsided, taking irregular routes, checking every corner of every room, moving silently as if to avoid detection. But no matter what precautions I took, the sense of being hunted never left me. Weeks later, the figure made its most direct appearance. I had returned home from a rare trip to the grocery store, careful to avoid usual routes, the rain having subsided to a drizzle. As I approached the building, I noticed movement in the parking lot. My stomach sank. The hooded figure stood there, motionless, waiting. I froze, panic rising, every instinct screaming to run. But something compelled me to confront it. I gripped my umbrella tightly, steeling myself for whatever came next. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just tilted its head ever so slightly. Then, slowly, it began to approach, each step deliberate, echoing on the wet concrete like a drumbeat of dread. I turned and ran, heart hammering, boots slipping on the wet pavement, the figure following with an almost supernatural silence. I barely reached the building entrance, fumbling with keys, praying for the doors to close behind me. When I finally slammed the door, I leaned against it, gasping for breath, and dared a glance through the peephole. The lot was empty. The rain, now a gentle drizzle, fell silently, masking any signs of the figure's retreat. But I knew it hadn't disappeared. I could feel its presence, patient, persistent, waiting for the next opportunity to appear. The following days were a haze of fear, paranoia, and isolation. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. Sleep was minimal. The rain had become both a companion and a tormentor, each drop reminding me of the figure's relentless presence. I began to feel that the storm was not natural, that the rain itself was an accomplice, washing the streets clean of normalcy and leaving only the figure and me. Days blurred into nights, and the rain became a constant companion, a relentless percussion that never ceased. I stopped keeping track of time altogether, the storms masking any sense of normalcy, as if the world itself had surrendered to the figure's presence. Even during brief moments of sunlight, I felt the memory of the hooded silhouette lurking in the edges of my vision. Every reflection in a store window, every darkened doorway, seemed to twitch with the suggestion of movement, and I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was conjured by my own mind. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a fragile, trembling vigilance. One evening, after a particularly violent downpour, I ventured out to collect a package from the lobby. The rain had subsided just enough for the streets to glisten, each puddle reflecting distorted, inverted worlds that played tricks on my eyes. The building's lobby was dim, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. I walked carefully, senses stretched taut, every sound magnified. Then I noticed it, a single wet footprint on the marble floor, fresh and glistening under the weak light. I froze. My pulse raced. The footprint was unmistakable. Large, deliberate, the kind of step that belonged to the figure I had been trying to escape. I glanced around the lobby, but it was empty, eerily so. The security camera blinked silently, recording, yet offering no reassurance. I hesitated, weighing my options. Retreat meant leaving the package behind, but advancing could bring me face to face with the figure. My hands gripped the strap of my bag as if it were a weapon, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Slowly, I moved forward, forcing my mind to focus on each step. The package was just a few feet away, yet the distance felt insurmountable. And then I saw it. Another footprint, appearing directly in front of me. It hadn't been there before. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed the package and turned to leave. But the temperature seemed to drop and the shadows thickened. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the lobby, a subtle distortion, the hint of a hunched figure receding into the darkness. I couldn't be certain. I bolted for the stairs, clutching the package, and barely made it to my apartment without encountering anything overtly visible. Still, the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin, chilling me from the inside out. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building sounded deliberate, as though someone or something was tracing my movements. The wind howled outside, rattling windows and sending water dripping from eaves in rhythmic, mocking percussion. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, scanning the street below. And then I saw it again. The figure, standing at the edge of the curb, head tilted, waiting. The rain ran down its coat, plastering it to its frame. But the outline was unmistakable. I froze. It made no move, no sound, only observed, patient, methodical. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the shadows. Days passed in a haze of fear, anxiety, and anticipation. I stopped leaving the apartment except for essentials, avoiding eye contact with strangers, and taking irregular routes whenever I ventured out. Even the postman, once a familiar presence, became a source of unease. I began double-locking doors, installing extra latches, and placing objects in front of the windows in hopes of deterring the figure. But it was relentless. The notes continued, small, precise, always tucked where I would find them. Soon. Sometimes a single word scrawled on yellowed paper. Other times, a more cryptic symbol drawn in ink. I started photographing them, documenting every detail, desperately trying to preserve evidence of my torment. Then came the sound. A whispering, low and urgent, slithering through the walls. The pipes, the very air of my apartment. I couldn't localize it, couldn't identify its source. Sometimes it was outside my bedroom door. Sometimes it seemed to echo from the kitchen. I began leaving lights on constantly, the harsh illumination failing to dispel the sense of malice that had seeped into the air. The whispering grew more distinct over time, forming words I could almost make out. You can't hide. You can't escape. It knows. My pulse would spike every time, and I'd retreat to the corner of the room, flashlight clutched tightly, willing the hours to pass. One particularly torrential night, I ventured to the window to glimpse the street. The rain fell in sheets, yet I could make out movement through the watery haze. The figure stood at the far end of the street, motionless, perfectly still, yet radiating awareness. I tried to blink it away, convinced that exhaustion was fabricating the shape. But as lightning streaked across the sky, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the face beneath the hood. Pale, elongated, eyes glinting in the reflection of puddles, observing me with a patience that was almost sentient. I recoiled, tripping backward onto the floor, heart hammering, unable to shake the image from my mind. I began to notice subtle manipulations of my environment. Objects shifted positions overnight. Small disturbances designed to unsettle. A chair turned slightly. A book left open to a disturbing passage. My keys rearranged. I was meticulous about leaving the apartment. Yet the figure seemed capable of entering regardless of precautions. Panic became my constant companion. I could feel the oppressive gaze even when the streets were empty. Even when I was alone in the apartment, I started talking to myself to maintain sanity, muttering reassurances, but they rang hollow. Then, a neighbor mentioned something strange. The day had been bright and clear, yet they had seen a tall figure standing in the rain outside my building. My heart sank. The figure didn't need rain to appear. It was omnipresent, patient, watching, waiting. That evening, I barricaded my doors, unplugged my phone, and turned off every light. I sat in the center of the apartment, flashlight in hand, breathing shallowly, listening. And then came a sound I could not ignore. The soft, deliberate scraping of boots on the balcony. I froze. The figure had reached me. The scraping continued for a few tense seconds, then stopped. I held my breath, every nerve screaming, every instinct urging me to flee. Slowly, I crept toward the balcony, flashlight trembling in my hands. Nothing. Just the empty rain-soaked railing, glistening under the dim street lights. For a moment, relief washed over me, fragile and fleeting, until I noticed a small envelope tucked into the corner of the balcony floor. Hands shaking, I opened it. Inside, a single word was written: found. I dropped the envelope, stumbling backward, my mind racing. The figure hadn't needed to enter. It had been here, observing, manipulating, testing the limits of my fear. And in that moment, I realized the terror wasn't the figure itself. It was the knowledge that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, it would always be there, watching, waiting, silent, patient, and the rain continued to fall.